it's my great pleasure tonight to welcome three guests. I think it's the first time since the Tolpuddle Radical History School went online that we had three guests. We had three guests when we were forced to go online for the main festival. We've not done a Tuesday night session with three guests, so we might just run over the 8 o'clock tonight. We'll see how it goes. Just remind you about the TUC Code of Conduct. Please be kind and courteous to each other. If you do have a question crosses your mind, please put it into the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. That would be absolutely fantastic, and we'll deal with questions at the end. Is that okay? So I'm going to introduce Matt Tiller and Greg Foxsmith from the Jack Leslie campaign, and Jason Lee. Some of you remember him from his Notts Forest days. I certainly remember him from those days, who now works for the PFA. Jason, do you want to say what your role is there?
Yeah, and before you make that mistake again, it's Nottingham Forest and it's Notts County.
Sorry, it's not. Very good. I like it. Yeah. Very
You're not allowed to get away with that. I had to learn a long time ago when I signed for Forest that you can't get the two confused. So it's a big rivalry there.
No.
But no, I work for the PFA, and the PFA is an affiliate of trade union. So that would give you a little bit of context as to how and maybe why I'm kind of involved in these discussions with TUC and anybody else around governance and whatever it may be. So I'm an Equalities Executive, and also I work across education, and I wear quite a few different hats, but we'll probably talk about that as time goes on. So
we'll talk about that at the end. And I think thank you. No, I think you're going to talk about a couple of reports that have come out recently. Is that right as well?
Yeah, we can talk about some of the stuff that we've done. No, we can talk about some of the stuff that we've kind of tried to implement and support and be educational around. So yeah, we'll cover that later on.
Perfect. Okay, so now I'm going to hand over to Matt, who is going to tell us the story of Jack Leslie, and a very interesting story it is too. Over to you, Matt.
Thanks. Thanks. I'm going to immediately hand over to Greg, who is going
to. We are a double act, and we like to toss a coin. We never know who's going to start, but I think I tossed the coin today. And so Matt and I are going to share the story of Jack Leslie together. And I'm going to just introduce his early life before Matt goes on to the main reason that we find the Jack Leslie story interesting, because of what happened with his England call-up. And then I just want to wrap up with a bit about the campaign that we founded for a statue for Jack Leslie, and to use his story to combat racism. So here's a picture of Jack, as you can see, a handsome fellow, and arms folded defiantly. Love this pose. The Jack story really starts, I suppose, as everyone's story does, with parentage. His father, John Francis Leslie, was born in Jamaica, 1863, travelled the world as a sailor, and then when he was in London, he met Anne Regler, a white lady from Islington. They married, they had 2 daughters, and then in 1901, Jack was born. Now, John, the father, continued going to sea, but then settled in East London, lived in Canning Town with the children. As Jack grew up, he went to school and then got work as a boiler maker, so very much in the East End, but loved his football. And his first side was a London League side, Barking Town, so not a professional football club. But whilst Jack was there, they won the Essex Senior Cup, 1919-20. It's a great photo here of Jack. You can see front row in the team, and then represented London as well. And bearing in mind, this is 1920, First World War was only recently finished. Jack was just too young to serve in that conflict. But in 1920, he himself was going to France, not thankfully for him to do conflict at the Somme, but to play for Barking against French teams in Paris. They were a very successful outcome, and that drew his attention to Plymouth Argyle in the league, who went on to sign Jack. So the story then goes to 1921. Just to put it in radical history context, 1921 was the miners' lockout in the Forest of Dean. You can read more about that on the Radical History website. It was also, back in Jack's roots in East London, the Poplar Rates strike, where working class boroughs fight back against austerity led to 30 councillors going to prison for their refusal to levy rates that citizens couldn't pay. Again, I'm grateful to the Radical History website for that story. But 1921 was also Jack moving to Plymouth Argyle. And that's really where our interest begins, because Matt and myself were Plymouth Argyle fans. So we sort of knew of him vaguely as a historical Argyle figure and a successful one, but we didn't really know the full story and the significant story until very recently. But why on earth, you might wonder, would someone playing for Plymouth Argyle, who were then a third division team, get a call up for England? Well, I'm going to pass to Matt to tell you a bit about Jack's time at Argyle and how it was he came to the England selection committee.
Sorry about that. So I had muting issues and cursor issues. Curse the cursor. Hopefully you can hear me now. And we're back with the presentation. I'll just whiz it back. There we are. So yeah, it is a great honour to talk about Jack Leslie, because as we know, he is a great Plymouth Argyle legend, as we learnt. And he signed from Barking in 1921 and played for Argyle until 1935, 400 appearances, 137 goals, making him the club's fourth highest scorer in history. The club's top scorer being Jack's famed striking partner, pictured here, Sammy Black. And they really were famed, even though they played in the third and second division. And Sammy joined the club in 1924 when Jack had already been there for 3 years. This picture was plucked from the Times archive during the campaign. They went searching in their archives and found this picture that we hadn't seen before. And it's it's a remarkable picture capturing these two incredible characters. And one thing that's amazing is that Jack's, although he was clearly a very talented player, his career didn't take off instantly. And one of the things that I love about Jack's story is the faith that his manager showed in him for several years, really. And this is the manager, Bob Jack, who was an Argyle legend on the pitch and as a manager as well for many, many years. And he played a crucial role in that England call-up, which we'll learn more about later on. But so Jack kind of his first few years were not that successful. He made a few appearances, but there wasn't a real sort of sign that he was, going to get an England call up in those first few years. But in 1924, things changed for Jack and for Plymouth Argyle. They actually toured. So they sailed off to South America. There's Jack sort of on the right-hand side in the middle row there. They're all looking very dapper. They're sailing off to South America and to tour the continent. And Jack played in all 9 matches, in fact. And here's a lovely sort of picture from South America. And obviously, if this was a film, the Argyle team would beat Argentina. So it should be a film, because they did beat Argentina. They did. In fact, they beat Uruguay as well, the 2 teams that contested the first World Cup final in 1930, which is pretty amazing. But they played lots of matches, and okay, they did lose against them as well. But it's still very impressive. And there's some lovely pictures from Jack's family, who've been a wonderful part of the campaign for Greg and I. They've shared some photos and wonderful memories of Jack. And it was after that tour of South America that Jack became a regular in the Argyle side. In 1924-25, he became a regular, playing 40 times, scoring 14 goals. And but as happened many times in the 1920s, Argyle finished runners-up to their rivals Exeter, our rivals. But back then, only one team got promoted. So sadly, That year, Swansea went up and not us. And that year, Jack got married in the close season. And it's here that I guess it was a sort of turning point in his career, and should have been a turning point in his life and in the history of the sport. And so we're going to look at that story in more detail now. This picture is from August the 31st, 1925, and it's from the Daily Mirror, a national newspaper, of course. And Argyle were on fire at the start of that season. By the time the England selection committee met on the 5th of October, 1925, Plymouth topped the division, having scored 31 goals in 8 games, 6 notched by Jack. And they played gained national attention. When people sort of wonder about the selection of a 3rd division player, here's Jack scoring, and a lovely sort of close-up portrait of Jack in a national newspaper. And it's also believed that Bob Jack, being a well-connected manager, his son actually played for England 9 times across the 20s and 30s. He recommended Jack for the national side. And, you know, it must have been a combination of both the stats and that recommendation. And but Jack really entered the national consciousness that year. The selection committee met to choose the full England side to play Ireland in Belfast later that month, on that 5th of October, after the Charity Shield game at White Hart Lane. The Charity Shield was then a match between amateurs and professionals. The amateurs actually won that 6-1, and the FA bigwigs chose 3 amateurs for the England team, including another 3rd division player. So that kind of puts Jack's selection in context. The final squad of 13, including Jack Leslie, as one of 2 travelling reserves. Jack Leslie, the young emerging inside left for Plymouth Argyle, was about to take his first step on the international ladder. Now, that was reported in several papers across the country. This is the Nottingham Journal from the 6th of October, 1925. You can see towards the bottom, reserved to travel, Nuttall and Bolton Wanderers, and Leslie, Plymouth Argyle. And it did attract sort of some comments. So this is the Western Daily Press, local to us. It said an interesting feature to Southerners of the England 11 chosen to oppose Ireland is the selection of J.F. Leslie, the Plymouth Argyle inside forward. Leslie, a man of colour, which is probably one of the more polite ways that he's described back then. It's obviously a different language, which will come up in some of the later slides. But he was one of 3 players persuaded by Bob Jack to leave Barking Town for professionalism at Plymouth. And it sort of complements his play. And in the same newspaper a few days later, they report an injury to another player and suggest that a substitute, of course, will now have to be found. And it's not unlikely that Leslie, the darky forward of Plymouth Argyle, that's how he's often referred to as, will fill the vacancy. Now, of course, we know that didn't happen. And close to the game, the team was published again with a different pair of reserves. And Jack was not injured, he was not suspended. And this is how he described it in his own words when interviewed in 1978, the time of Viv Anderson's selection. He said, everybody in the club knew about it. The town was full of it. All them days ago, it was quite a thing for a little club like Plymouth to have a man called up for England. I was proud, but then I was proud just to be a paid footballer. And then he went on. Then all of a sudden, everyone stopped talking about it. Sort of went dead quiet, didn't look me in the eye. I didn't ask outright, so I could see by their faces it was awkward, but I did hear roundabout like that the FA had come to have another look at me. Not at me football, but at my face. They asked and found they'd made a ricket, found out about me daddy, and that was it. There was a bit of an uproar in the papers. Folks in the town were very upset. No one ever told me official like, but that had to be the reason. My mum was English, but my daddy was black as the ace of spades. There wasn't any other reason for taking my cap away. And one of the wonderful things about the campaign is sort of hearing more about Jack as a sort of personality, a sort of honourable player and a humble man. And I think, you know, the evidence aside, you know, you have to believe the man himself. And there's one paper actually did report that they were unaware he hadn't travelled and did say Leslie has scored plenty of goals for the Argyle, is an inside forward of great ability and will soon work his way into representative matches. So it's clear he was tipped for international representation. That was reported many times. And here, sort of, you imagine some of the comments on social media of people going, "Oh, you're just bringing it up now because of Black Lives Matter or what the events in Bristol with the Colston statue," but it was reported at the time. Here is the Daily Herald from the 28th of October, shortly after that England match, and asking the question, you know, who was the reserve for England, Leslie or Earl, and that continues on, sort of questioning the snobbery that goes on in first-class football. This is will we not be surprised to know, a left-wing newspaper. But it was reported, and also they actually followed up, and they went to the FA, who were adamant that he'd never been picked, but the press association, who had sent the team sheet out across the country, said he was definitely selected. And also it was reported locally in a very kind of oblique way. This is the Football Herald down in Plymouth. And it says here that this reporter says, "My pen is under a ban in the matter. But I may say that a mistake was made in London and transmitted to me. Anyway, Leslie was at the time playing quite well enough to be chosen." So we don't know, of course, exactly how this transpired. You know, it is likely that some of the FA committee must have known that he was black, because there were some Southwest representatives. You can imagine that perhaps it wasn't mentioned at the meeting. They just talked about his record and the recommendation and moved on. Perhaps there was pressure brought to bear later on. So we're not sort of necessarily casting every single member of the FA committee in a bad light. There were probably heroes and villains that we'll never identify. But the fact is, he was picked and then he was deselected. But Jack bore no bitterness. He just got on with his football. He scored 17 goals that season, but Argyle were runners-up yet again. They kept trying to make it through to the second division. Here's a nice picture with Jack on the second from left there. But they did finally make it in the 1929-30 season, and after a decade of trying. And after that promotion, there's the crowd celebrating there, and a cartoon from the programme of that season. The next season was probably the high point of Jack's Argyle career. He scored 21 goals and helped the team to 4th place in Division 2. In today's money, we'd say they'd be knocking on the door of the Premiership, but back then, with only the Champions promotion, 4th meant absolutely nothing. But it remains the joint highest finish of Plymouth Argyle, and it also, this was the year that Jack was appointed club captain, and that really is significant because there's a cartoon showing him at the centre of the team, the other Argyle players and manager surrounding him. Becoming captain was a massive achievement, almost certainly the first black footballer to captain a professional league side. And this is a time when say white people were not used to taking orders from black people. There's the story of Walter Toll, which I highly recommend you looking into, the professional footballer who became an officer in the trenches and died in the First World War, which actually went against army regulations. But he was such a leader of men at the time that his troops supported him becoming an officer. It's a remarkable story, Walter Toll. And I think it goes to show how respected Jack was by his fellow players, the fans, and the manager, of course. This is one of the things he got to do as captain. The Plymouth Argyle sort of experimented with a flight to games, Plymouth being a long way away, and they had a flight to Stoke. None of the players went, except for Jack on the return journey only. So the players still had to travel like 10 hours back there and back. But Jack got to fly, and then the FA banned flight travel after that one. So the FA are villains yet again. Sadly, in 1933, an injury kind of put a sort of slow end to Jack's career. It was a lace from one of those kind of old heavy leather balls that injured his eye, and he was never the same player again. These are some lovely photos from Jack's granddaughters that they've shared with us of Jack in action and Jack leading a horse around Home Park. And also through his career, he, after that England selection, he was, as I say, he was nationally famous. This is a cutting from the Daily Mirror in 1933, which described Leslie's wing partnership with Sammy Black as one of the most famous of post-war football. And the Daily Mail, of all papers, called him a coloured genius in 1932. And the following year wrote, had he been white, he would have been a certain English international. I don't think they were campaigning, but I think they were just stating it as a fact and their footballing opinion. So Greg is going to talk about the campaign and its sort of place in recent history, of course. But one of the great things about the campaign is some of the kind of memories that have been generated. And this is from the scrapbook of an Argyle fan, Bill Stevens, who this was posted on Twitter by his son, Mark, and this Jack shaking hands with the Manchester United captain before the FA Cup third round match, which we won. There he is performing his duties as captain. I had the privilege of speaking to Bill, age 95, shortly before he sadly passed away. And he sort of filled me in on Jack as a wonderful player, but also as a gentleman who played the game in the right way. He never cheated, he never fouled, was a real gentleman, and that really comes across. And I think it's it's kind of testimony like that that's made the campaign even more satisfying for Greg and I think, to hear more about Jack the player and Jack the man. So I'm gonna let Greg move on to talk about the campaign, but before we do, we'd like to play. There's a really lovely film that Sky made with us as part of Black History Month last year, and there's some lovely photos that the local museum, the Box, uncovered as a result of the campaign, looking out for these pictures. So yeah, let's share this film with you now. Had he been white, he would have been a certain English international.
It was a lot tougher then, and he must have gone through a lot of stuff.
They checked his face, but it was black, not white, so they just denied him.
You know, we talk about what we go through now in society, what they must have gone through to be not even picked.
I feel robbed from my granddad. It would have meant the world for him.
Football legend, second to none, Jack Leslie came to Devon, 1921.
He should have been England's first black international footballer, but he never did play for his country because of the colour of his skin.
Jack Leslie came from East London here to Plymouth Argyle in 1921, where he became a bit of a club legend.
He became captain of the club, probably the first black captain of a professional side. So a pioneering legend just for that alone.
Jack Leslie was the first black footballer to be selected to play for England. But then his name was withdrawn from the team sheet, and that's almost certainly because the England selection committee realised he was black and his face didn't fit.
It's very difficult to comprehend how, you know, the colour of your skin can dictate, you know, how successful you can be in a job that you do. You know, you work hard for it, you score so many goals for a certain club, and become a legend, and you get treated in a certain way, which is obviously very disrespectful and very sad.
He told the story to a journalist in the 70s and said the FA came to have a look at me, not at my football, but at my face. So, yeah, it was the colour of his skin that denied him that chance.
His moment of what he'd been working his whole career for, because of the colour of his skin, it was just snatched out of his hands again. If he was alive today, where would he be? And what would he have done for England if they'd let him play? But we're never going to know.
It took another 53 years for a black player to finally feature for England. Viv Anderson in 1978. Since then, nearly a third of call-ups have been of black heritage, and now 100 have won England caps.
Obviously, you know, Viv was the first black player to play for England. It was, you know, a fantastic kind of moment, you know. But yeah, for sure. If the earlier start, who knows where we would be now?
He was an unassuming, very modest guy, very well liked. And when he spent his pre-retirement years at West Ham in the boot room, he often was so unassuming that some of the West Ham legends didn't even realise he had a football career, let alone the England story.
Jack Leslie put out the West Ham boots for the last time. Jack retires today at the age of 80. He's a former professional footballer himself. He played for Plymouth Argyle. He's very popular with the players and with manager John Lyall as well.
Yeah, you'll be grafting, mate.
Yeah. I suppose, you know, we're all very grateful, and we've enjoyed it, and it's been marvellous to have you.
Yeah.
I'm sure the lads would echo that. It's been a great career.
So we're taking Jack Leslie's story into schools, we're doing school assemblies, and it's going down really well. You probably know, guys, right? This is Black History Month, yeah? And so I'm going to tell you, basically, a bit of black history, a black history story about a footballer. I think the story of a footballer who was good enough to play for England but then denied his opportunity is one that has a beautiful simplicity to it that people understand and instinctively react and know that that is wrong.
Like, he should have been really famous. It makes me feel like it's unfair and everyone should be treated the same. Really sad, because he was so excited for his big moment, and then it just got taken away from him.
Hearing a story like this, so I can tell, you know, maybe my two young daughters who are going to school in Plymouth, like this happened. If we could speak about it now and carry on, you know, his legacy and other people's, I think it's a wonderful thing.
A wizard in defense or attack was called up for England, but they sent him back.
When I first heard the story of Jack Leslie, I immediately just wrote a song and started playing it at gigs, and the response was great because people had not heard this story before.
Well, we thought we'd do something to recognise Jack Leslie and celebrate that and crowdfund for a statue. We were absolutely amazed at how that took off.
It would be fantastic to unveil the statue here at Home Park in 2021 because that would be the centenary of his signing.
For me, just to be a a black player in Plymouth, it made me feel a sense of pride and enjoyment that I can read about someone that was a pioneer for a lot of black players.
The son of a Jamaican father and English mother, his name should have been remembered forever as England's first black player. But now in bronze, Jack Leslie will be immortalised.
Well, it's always good to see that film again. It reminds me that we had anticipated unveiling a statue in the centenary year, which is this year, but COVID has intervened. We're a little bit behind schedule. It may be next year, but it was Jack's story and what we learned that caused Matt and I to want to start a campaign for a statue for Jack Leslie. That was our first starting point. A very simple one. This guy should have a statue. We should tell the story, information around the plinth. That's what we set out to do, but it became much more than that. We didn't really know much about statues, to be honest. One of the first things I found out was how few statues there are of people from black or diverse backgrounds. A few of those are of contemporary footballers, but outside of that, very little. There's a few more recent examples, the Mary Seacole statue and others. No black statues in the southwest. Of course, instead, we celebrate by statues people like Colston. So Matt and I set up the campaign and we decided to crowdfund for a statue. We're proud of the fact that the money we've raised has come from individuals and organisations. The TUC, in fact, have been one of our backers. And basically, it's football fans and Equalities campaigners and people who have just reacted and responded to the story. And along the way, we've learned a lot, and we found a lot of different images of Jack Leslie. We've researched the history. We've had kind of ideas that have helped us along the way. But we decided as well not just to raise money for a statue, but to tell Jack's story and to use it in a positive way. As you saw in the film, there was we've taken it out into schools with positive messaging. We don't believe that this is a story, or that any black story should be pigeonholed into a month in October for Black History Month. This is a story that's universal and can resonate totally. So we have our aims and objectives, which are threefold. One, to raise money for a statue, which we've hit our target. Two, to tell Jack's story and celebrate it. And three, to combat racism, prejudice and discrimination and celebrate diversity. And let's be under no doubt that the issues that Jack faced in 1921 are still there today. They are sometimes expressed in different ways, but they are still prevalent. Oddly, in 1921, Jack, when he came to Plymouth, which was not a diverse city, was a popular figure. He was well liked by home fans and by fellow footballers. As you know, he became club captain. He did get some chanting directed at his skin colour from opposing players, but it wasn't the sort of overt, hostile prejudice and racist abuse that players had in the 70s and 80s particularly, where I think sectors of society, perhaps feeling threatened by post-Windrush immigration, reacted in the vile way that we saw. That has largely disappeared from the terraces, but of course we've seen it pop up in other ways, and particularly with social media abuse and targeted abuse online and hiding behind keyboard warriors. Jack himself, therefore, not perhaps the target of direct vile racism, but the England selection thing, as you heard, was more his face doesn't fit. Now, this is the FA. Matt referred to some of their policies at the time, who banned women's football in 1921, because during the war, when league football was cancelled, because all the men were away fighting, women's football became incredibly popular and was attracting crowds of tens of thousands. And the FA, threatened by that in 1921, banned it. And it was almost 60 years before women's football started to build up again to levels that we're seeing now. They just felt that Jack's face doesn't fit. And is that something that we have now put behind us? Well, of course, it is with the FA, whose messaging is very positive, with the PFA, with the FSA. All bodies really make the right noises and gestures. And yet, when footballers take the knee to make an overt anti-racist stance, we see booing at the first football game at which fans were allowed back. That lucky small minority of people who could get a ticket for a game after a year of COVID, and they took the time and the trouble to boo players for making a stance against racism and for their beliefs. And it goes beyond that because, as you will probably know, one or more Conservative MPs have vowed to boycott England games in the European Championships over those players' decisions. But let's not make any bones about it. This is political. It has become politicised. And it's not just something that can be brushed away as culture wars or viewpoints. This is becoming a political issue. So Lee Anderson, the MP for Ashfield in Nottinghamshire, has said that he will boycott going to England matches because of this stance. I can only imagine the players' disappointment that the Tory MP will no longer be in the crowd. But he goes on to say, and run the risk of becoming like the Labour Party, that is nothing in common with their traditional supporters. All forms of racism or violence should be stamped out, he said, which is nice of him, but this is not the way. And he, white Tory MP, Mr. Anderson, didn't go on to say how it is that he felt that black players should be allowed to make their protest or stance, or their white colleagues who want to say something. Presumably, he knows best, but he's been rather quiet on that. He just wants to ban it or to boycott it. And it's that thing again of, well, yes, we know that racism is vile and we're against it, but we don't want to make a fuss, and that we don't want it to be demonstrated against in this way or that way, that you can see almost resonates with the stance of the 19 20s, where it just doesn't fit. Taking the knee, not really British, that's not right. And it's that sort of covert, dog whistle, under the radar, subliminal racism that empowers the fans who want to boo and undermines the efforts of Kick It Out and Stamp Out Racism and Black Lives Matters and all equalities groups and people who actually want to campaign and make a stance. And so it was that it was just over a year ago that the Colston statue came down and was torn down, a statue of a notorious slave trader in Bristol after a long campaign, and now resurrected, still covered in graffiti and on its side in Bristol Museum with education and information about Colston's role in the slave trade and Bristol's part in slavery. And that to me is a step forward and progress. So as the Colston statue comes down, we are excited and delighted that the Jack Leslie statue in short order, either later this year or maybe next year, will be going up. And ours is a campaign, I'm delighted to say, that has had cross-party support. I will make that point. We've had backing from the TUC, from our local Plymouth MP and from Plymouth City Council, but we have had Conservative supporters as well. And we're proud of that. We like the fact that we have cross-party support for a positive statue campaign, but we are not shy to make political points or to recognise that Black Lives Matters and that history is a political construct. And we will not be shy of taking Jack's story out there and using it as a positive platform. We hope that society can be better in 2021 and moving forward than it was in 1921 or in the 1970s. And we hope that Jack's story will enable us to take that positive messaging out there. But then I'm doing, my best with Matt, but who are we to speak about it? Because although we consider ourselves and believe ourselves to be positively anti-racist and to take political positions without fear to do that, we of course accept that we ourselves have not being of diverse background, have not directly experienced that what it's like to go onto a football pitch and have a hostile crowd or chanting or jeering or being targeted. And we've been privileged to meet footballers and others who have. And it's a particular delight that we can team up. So thank you to the to this session for putting us with Jason Lee, who will share his experiences, and I'm happy to pass that baton to Jason now. And I hope, Jason, as well, you'll be able to share with us what you felt when you heard about the Jack Leslie story and what progress be done. And also, we are very open to knowing what can we do better to use stories like Jack's in a positive way, because we really want to do that, and we need to be assisted and guided by you and others who have lived that experience and perhaps to an extent still do. So thanks everyone for letting us tell the Jack Leslie story and a backdrop on the campaign. Jason, I'll pass to you now.
Should we ask Matt to? Oh, thanks very much, Matt. That's what I was about to ask you to stop screen sharing. Thank you very much. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Jake.
Hello, I'm not sure if you can hear me. There's been a little bit of a lag. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we can hear you, Jason. Yeah, we can hear you, yeah.
Maybe it's because you're screen sharing and one thing and another, but no, look, listen, I really appreciate you giving me some time to spend with you this evening and join the discussion. For myself, there's some similarities with Jack because I'm from the East End of London, born in the 70s, also mixed race. And, when you talk about race and colour and language, for myself, I suffered discrimination from both sides at an early age. and people wouldn't really fully understand that. So if you're racist, whether you're black or white, obviously you're going to take umbrage to the fact that there's mixed relationships. So that was always a bone of contention for myself growing up, you know, myself and my siblings. And I know a lot of mixed race children struggle with their identity also growing up. So I can only imagine how difficult it would have been for Jack back in those days. But, you know, cultural awareness and this that, and the other, for me, I was always immersed amongst all of my family. Culturally, I was always brought up in and around my black family. So I had no worries, no issue being or feeling comfortable, you know, with black or white people, whatever it may be. So that was something that I can definitely relate with Jack Leslie regarding that. And also going into football at a very young age, from the age of 16. And I remember one of my first conversations, I wasn't in an academy or centre of excellence, but one of my first conversations was with a coach who was telling me, look, if you want to make it in the game, you're going to have to accept that there's going to be some racism directed towards you. And I mean, is that really one of the conversations you want to be having with somebody at any stage of their life or career? But that was, I would say, part and parcel really of football, society, and for people, you know, that wanted to make their way in any chosen profession, that you would have to deal with discrimination, whether it be sexism, homophobia, and racism. And I'm glad we're in a time now where we are challenging all forms of discrimination, and the fact that we're having these conversations. And I know some people get tired and fed up of talking about it, but I spend all day, every day talking about it because I live it. You know, whether it be with family and friends or with people like yourselves who are genuinely interested and want to be more open-minded and find a way to, you know, find a solution around this. For me, it's very, very helpful, very beneficial, and rewarding if you feel that you are getting through to some people around discrimination. So football for me has given me opportunity to not only try and break down some barriers alongside all my peers who opened the way. You know, Jack would have been one of the early pioneers, but lots of footballers since have done, you know, spectacular things in and around the game. So I always had somebody that I could identify with and believe that. I mean, John Barnes was one of my favourite players growing up. I always felt that, you know, I could identify with John Barnes and there'll be an opportunity for me to go in and maybe be judged on, you know, my talent or my ability. But we all know that there are some unconscious biases, and biases is something that, you know, I will speak about briefly, is that I think there's very few people that could say that they don't have any biases. I think once we admit that, you know, I have biases because of my circumstances and how I grew up and certain experiences. So I'm always honest about that. But I continue to work on those. I continue to educate myself and learn more and be more open-minded. And hopefully I won't make any of those mistakes. And if I do make any mistakes, it comes from an honest place. So when people get very defensive and they say that, you know, I'm not racist, you know, I've got a black friend, I live down the road from somebody who's black, I went to school with some, it's the wrong response. That's not what we're looking for. You're just looking for somebody to say, okay, I'm listening. You know, what is it, you know, yourself are uncomfortable with? What is it that you don't like? And how can I help? How can I help with that? So even terminology over the years where, you know, somebody of color, I was listening very intently to the way you guys told the story, dusky, you know, all into different terminologies. I mean, you listen to it now and it's shock horror, but, you know, for myself growing up in the 70s, mixed race, I would be referred to as half caste. And you will hear that this day, you know, from people, myself and older, refer to mixed race people as half caste and also refer to black people as coloured. The point being is that language changes. Our younger generation will always dictate to us, the older generation, how they want to be perceived and how they want to be addressed. And it's not for us to say that, oh, in our day, this is what we used to say, so therefore it must be okay. what we need to be saying is, okay, I'm listening and I will continue to evolve. And that's what it's all about. We're evolving. So young people, I'm driven by young people all day, every day. You know, young children are born, they're not born racist, but we know for a fact something changes. And it changes because of peer pressure, family and friends who might have certain stereotypes or beliefs. So this is how it happens. This is how we learn and pick up some really negative traits along the way. So, you know, my career was long and expansive. I had 21 years as a player, left London to play for Lincoln. That was really the start of my journey. That was tough because being a London boy. So I can only imagine the story of Jack, you know, going from London to Plymouth. And people take this, you know, for granted. They think for anybody, especially as a young person leaving home and going to live in a strange place, wherever it may be, is not easy to overcome. And you hope that people give you an opportunity and you get treated well. So, you know, I left London, played in Lincoln for a couple of years. It was great. Later in my career, I went to Scotland to play for a team called Falkirk. I heard lots of stories about don't go and play in Scotland. For me, I'm always a person that gives people an opportunity, and I take people as I find them. I can only say my experience in Scotland was fantastic. People was warm, they was great. That was my experience. So if anybody asked me, I would say, you know, my experience was great. I wouldn't be negative about it. But I know people that have had negative experience, you know, so I can't speak for everybody. And that's the thing about racism or whatever it is you suffer. We've all got difference of opinion, different experiences, and we have to respect that. So from playing and coaching and management, I spent the last 8 years in administration, and that's meant working with the governing bodies. You know, I mentioned earlier, I alluded to the fact that PFA are a trade union affiliate, and I think probably our coming together has come from Jed Greby, Show Racism the Red Card, I would imagine, because he badgers me a lot. I'm an ambassador for Show Racism the Red Card. And these conversations, trying to support each other and getting the message out there to as many people that will listen. So I've probably taken up more time than I wish to. I'll be very brief with what I'm going to say now, as opposed to something that we've done over the last few years to try and address some of the racial stereotypes that we talk about. 2 years ago, 2019, we did an hashtag enough social media boycott, which was 24 hours. You may or may not remember that, but that kind of opened up the floodgates really for a lot of people to get behind that. It was only 24 hours. Some people would have thought it was tokenistic, but the idea behind that was to kind of name and shame the social media companies. And what happened was it brought them to the table. They started to have dialogue and conversation with us because they realized that, oh, okay, so people are now boycotting and people are now starting to really throw stones at us, at our windows, at our building, and criticize, you know, what we stand for. And over the last 2 years, there's been continued conversations in and around how do we fight back against social media firms and companies. So social media, we know, it's the bane of my life. I mean, I don't spend any time on social media, but I've got children, and I know the majority of people do spend time on social media. So there's always stories and discrimination being brought to myself, and I have to find a way to try and tackle it on their behalf. So that was the reason we did that. And then almost a year to the day, we did a run repeat report around racial bias in football commentary. You may or may not have seen something around that. And one of my reasons behind that was that off the back of what Raheem Sterling mentioned around the media and the way certain players are portrayed, that it needed to be addressed. I know the power of language, and I know, having spoken to my peers over the years, that being in certain environments, that certain language and certain behaviours would be accepted and allowed. And how do we tackle that? So the first thing for me to tackle racism would be to tackle language. You know, it's not rocket science. Once we delve into language and how it can affect people and start checking people and start challenging, we might actually stand a chance of overcoming, you know, bigotry and all the stuff that we're talking about today. So that was the reason behind both reports. The last one I mentioned, the racial bias in commentary. I mean, the football establishment, especially the broadcasters, they tried to fight back. I'm not going to lie. They tried to defend themselves. They got extremely defensive, which is what I was talking about earlier. And what I had to do was ensure that there was collated information, that it was data driven. Because without that, somebody, any black man, anybody screaming discrimination, if you can't back it up with context, people will always say, you don't know what you're talking about, or it's just your opinion. So it was important that that report, and both reports, I mean, especially the one I've just mentioned, Run Repeat, you guys can all go on, you just type in PFA Run Repeat report, you'll be able to download that report and see how data driven it was. And that it wasn't just myself throwing sound bites out. It showed over a period of time, and if we'd have gone back 10 years, 20 years, that certain biases have been attributed towards black footballers and not positively. So that was the reason behind that. So we have to keep finding ways to educate people, keep finding ways to prove that it is happening. We can't ignore it and say it's not happening, and just continue the dialogue that we're doing. So I'm hoping that might have raised some questions, and at the end we'll have lots of questions. I'll be happy to answer anything in and around that. But I'm just really appreciative of you guys giving me an opportunity to come on and join your discussion and maybe share some of my experiences.
Thank you very much, Jason. That's brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. Just to hear you talk about your experiences is just fantastic. And I really appreciate your giving up the time to be here with us tonight.
You're welcome.
A question for you straight away then. You talked about these two issues. Could you just repeat very slowly the website that's got the report on it? What's the name of the link we need?
If you was to type into Google search PFA Run Repeat report, you will find it. It will come up.
Run Repeat.
Because it was shared with everybody. It was about transparency. I mean, we had a number of calls. We did a call with probably 500 co-commentators, summarizers, broadcasters, all of the industry. They wanted to be part of this discussion. They wanted to ask questions, and there was people who tried to be clever, who tried to say, tried to poke holes in it. But I'm not a person to shy away from that. So it's always having a conversation about something and trying to share your thought process with somebody. I think more often than not, at the end of that conversation, people have a better understanding of where you've come from. So that was the reason why we commissioned that report.
So there was a more recent attempt to boycott social media, wasn't there, by professional footballers, which spread to other sportsmen as well, which I thought was excellent. I think social media happened.
Yeah, it happened the first time around when we did it. I mean, at the end of the day, we hear this all the time. We know it's a societal issue. It's not just football, but we shine a light on football, and football has the power to raise awareness. And we have players now. I'm really, really proud of them. The England team, Gareth Southgate, who I know personally, whether it be Raheem, whether it be Rashford, whether whoever it may be, players are politicising themselves, and they are talking about things that affect all of us. It's very difficult for anybody. People try to say, as an athlete, as a footballer, you just go and play football. That's what you get paid for. Well, hold on a minute. It's affecting my day-to-day life. It's affecting people that are close to me. It's something that's close to my heart. I'm going to put myself in that conversation and be part of it. And because of your profile, players are using their profile. People will jump on, and people will get behind what they're doing. What Rashford did around feeding the children and school meals was so impactful. So we know the power of young people and especially anybody with a profile celebrity. We can all help.
And this is a matter of education as well, isn't it? There was a recent case maybe 4 or 5 months ago where a 13-year-old boy was found to abuse somebody on social media. So, it's a matter of us getting the message out into schools to young people as well. So when you get 13-year-olds getting involved in the sort of language that was used in that case and the message that was delivered, we've all got a responsibility in terms of education across the board, I feel. And
that's where I allude to the fact that I know as young people, we're not born racist. So that young individual would have picked up from his peers. There's things I did and said when I was young, teenager, whatever it may be, that I'm not proud of because of the pressure you feel under to conform, and you say spiteful things and do things that are just ridiculous when you look back. So it's about addressing that. And parents, we're responsible for our children. It's as simple as that. We're responsible. We're the people that can go in and, you know, address any bad behaviour, and they're going to pick up good and bad behaviours. So, yeah, young people, we have to work with them. We have to continue. They are the future. They will, I would imagine, make the changes that we're all crying out for.
In fact, even in the last couple of days, Ollie Robinson, the English cricketer, has been hauled up and now suspended for making sexist and racist comments when he was considerably younger. So this isn't just about football; it's about all sports in many ways. Hamilton in motor racing is making similar points, isn't he?
Always. I mean, Lewis is out there on his own, isn't he?
Yeah. What's the panel's thoughts on how the ECB have dealt with Ollie Robinson? That's come from Nick.
For me, I mean, it's happening in football, so it feels like football has to lead the way. So we've had situations in football, whether it be black or white players. So, you know, Andre Gray, this is a story. I've known Andre Gray since he was a young player. Now, he was close to getting an England call-up some years back. He went from Luton to Brentford, and then from Brentford to Burnley in the Premier League. So there was quick moves, you know, throughout his career. He was flying. And retrospectively, once you become famous, people start to look through your archive. I do stuff around social media all the time with young players. What you say today is there forever. Okay, so people, they troll through, they find that stuff. And retrospectively, Andre Gray got a ban. So he went from Brentford to Burnley in the Premier League. Burnley was unaware of all of this. They lost a player, and he probably lost an opportunity to go into the England squad or England setup because of what happened retrospectively some years back and things that he did. So it wasn't just a white player or white people, black players have done it as well. So racism, as I explained earlier, it can happen from all of us, and we can all be sexist and homophobic. And we have to be mindful of social media in particular, because as I've said, what you say will stay up there for a long time. So this this cricketer that's retrospectively being dealt with now, I think at 18, 19, I think you are responsible for your actions. If we're talking about people that are under 16, they are considered minors. You know, we will spend more time trying to address that and work with them. But 18, 19, I think pretty much you're established by then. You know what you're doing. I think if you've made mistakes or you're being spiteful, you should. I do believe that you should have to pay for that. It sets a tone, and it really does show the industry and everybody else that you are serious about stamping it out.
Greg wants to come in.
Yeah, thanks. That's absolutely, I couldn't disagree with anything Jason said, but there's also, as always, a political angle to the whole thing about was he too young to know any better? Because people bring their own prejudices and perhaps class issues to it. So I've seen quite a few, again, Tory MPs and others coming in defence saying, "Oh, it's very tragic because he said he was too young. He didn't know what he was doing." But they're the same people, if you trawl back through their social history posts, who, for example, when commenting on Shamina Begum, who went to join, ISIS when she was late 15 and then into her early 16s, and people say, well, actually, she was too young to know what she was doing, and she had been groomed, and she ought to come back to this country for rehabilitation and a court case. I like you to say, oh, she knew exactly what she was doing. She was old enough to know, what she was doing. So suddenly people manage to get this divide in their brain to say that if you're from a certain background or colour, let's be honest about it, you're too young to know what you're doing. But if you're a poor white, cricketer from your less unprivileged background, suddenly, you're far too young. How could you possibly criticise the poor cricketer? So again, you've got to strip away the politics and treat people equally. And, if we're going to have an age or a cut-off point at which we should be forgiven for our mistakes, and I think they should be, because we all do. Jason's admitted some, and I certainly, would find the same. I was lucky enough, like Jason, that we didn't have social media stuff, recording everything we did. There should be a cut-off point, but if there is, you've got to apply it equally to, whether it's a young Asian girl from East London or a white, cricketer, from the suburbs. So, as always, politics is a factor.
I was driving back from Yorkshire today, and they're reporting another unnamed English cricketer who they've trolled through his tweets and found something else. So that's going to go on. We've got another question from Andy Linnington. Thanks for
It's opened the can of worms now, hasn't it?
Yeah. It's superb.
It's opened it up now. That's the point. It's opened it up.
It has. Andy Linnington says it's particularly depressing to see some MPs defending the booing or taking the knee. What can be done to tackle them, to use a football analogy? Anyone want to have a go at that? Jason, do you want to start that?
Well, I mean, I'll be brief. For me, I've been pretty much the whole of the season having to talk about this subject of taking the knee and the conflated messages around taking of the knee and politics. And quite clearly, at the end of the day, I think it's more impactful if players take the knee when people are saying they shouldn't take the knee. You don't need any agreement or people to buy into the fact. It's just that it was nice that the Premier League came together and they decided for the whole season that they would take the knee. So they kind of led the way. There was no discussion around it. All players knew they was taking the knee. Every club before a game took the knee. Going forward, that might be interesting to see what happens. Across the rest of the EFL, the rest of the EFL was left unguided. The EFL did not want to implement the same policy that all players should take the knee. So therefore, you had some players taking the knee and some players not. And then you get all the conflated messages around, well, why are players not taking the knee? If they're not taking the knee, that means they don't care. If you have somebody like Will Zaha standing up, well, if he's not taking the knee, it's not impactful. It doesn't. Everyone's got their own right and own way of approaching discrimination. And I think whatever you do that's impactful and gets a response is the way to go for you. You know, I don't believe we should allow, and I've done stuff with TalkSport, BT, Sky, everybody going into the Euros around the taking of the knee. We know what's coming down the pipe. Let's not be surprised, you know. Let's not be turning it down and muting it. Let's highlight the fact that people are booing. If it's the minority, which we keep hearing, a small minority of people are being discriminatory, drown them out. As a group of people, we have the power to challenge those minority who we're uncomfortable with. We're not happy with that. Drown them out. Be louder. That would be really, really heartwarming to hear people just, as soon as that booing comes in, just drown them out, embarrass the life out of them. You know, get the camera, highlight, point on those certain individuals. Let us see who you are. You know, it's about naming and shaming people. You're there. We know all the time over the years, football hooliganism, people have got great jobs. They go to a football match, they lose their mind. They become something else. Honing in up individuals so that we know we're working with all day, every day. We can see that by day as a football fan, that person's a bigot. And then in their workplace, they want to pretend to be something else. Highlight them. That's what we can do as a group of people. And that's me.
Great answer, Jason. Do you want to come back on that, Greg, or come in on that? Or
yeah, I just found another Tory MP. I mentioned one earlier, but Tory MP Brendan Clark-Smith compares England players taking the knee to Nazi salutes. I mean, is there any limit to which they will try to do this? But the cultural argument is, oh, Black Lives Matter is a political group and they're Marxist. But don't be fooled. The people running that are using that as a fig leaf because they feel uncomfortable with being faced with a direct, statement, whether it's a Black Power salute that we saw, decades ago, or taking the knee now. It is a statement. And Jason is absolutely right. You can't make a protest if nobody notices. There's no point in doing a statement if it's not visible. So these Tory MPs, I think, are causing a great disservice by providing a veneer of respectability to the boo boys and the idiots, the people who perhaps don't know better. How we deal with that? Well, I certainly have got nothing better to add to Jason's suggestion, because I was so dispirited actually when I tuned in and heard some boos that I thought I would have to boycott games just because I would get into a fight with somebody booing. I was too dispiriting for me. But now I'm enheartened and I want to get to my next game as soon as possible. And my God, I'm going to be cheering so loudly, you won't be able to hear a single boo. And that's what we all need to do. And thank you, Jason, for putting that positive solution to the way forward. Is racists are a minority. Let's drown them out.
Absolutely. There is a comment from Nicholas Crick to you and Matt. It says, I'm an Argyle supporter. I know during the recent BLM demo, a small number of so-called Argyle fans mounted a counter-protest on the Hoe. I'm sure both Greg and Matt know who they are. During the campaign, was there any reaction or dialogue with any of that group?
Yes, well, that was. All right then, Matt. You here?
Well,
I'm
not going to go into the what. Yeah, that we had a nemesis. Let's put it that way. But what Nicholas is referring to was that there were some kind of statue protectors who were Argyle fans who went up onto the Hoe to defend the war memorial at the time of some BLM marches. Of course, there were no threats to the war memorial. None of the protesters either planned or had any intention, and there was no vandalism of any of the monuments on the Hoe. And so it was a kind of a pretty sort of pathetic statement. And in fact, in the end, they were basically a group of drunk wannabe hooligans who then themselves were racist towards members of the public who were going about their peaceful business on the Hoe, which is a beautiful part of Plymouth if you don't know it.
Yeah, I know it.
Yeah. So yes, we did have some issues, but nothing. I mean, one of the great things was it was very, very positive, but there were, of course, on social media sort of questioning of the story, and that's part of the reason why, when I was sort of talking about the story, making it clear that those people were saying, oh, it's just made up because of the Black Lives Matter movement. You've just sort of made this up. It's a construct. Well, no. This is a piece of history that needs to be told, that is going to educate you, and also, how much better would that piece of history have been for Greg and I as Argyle supporters who started going in the 80s? That story was never told, and for young black players coming to Plymouth back then, Ronnie Mojay, who's a bit of an Argyle legend, we talked to a lot, who was a supporter of the campaign, said he'd never heard the story. It would have been really inspiring for him and helpful. He did have a great time in Plymouth, but it would have been helpful for him, I think.
Very good friend of mine, Ronnie Mojay, by the way. We both started at Charlton together, so both from East London. Yeah. And I mention it again, like you've mentioned, for him to be ending up in Plymouth, and learning what he's learned. Yeah, I remember him speaking about this story. So
yeah, I think it's also worth saying that the club chairman, Simon Hallett, and his wife are very pro Black Lives Matter type issues. And before Matt and I had even launched our statue campaign, there's a new grandstand at Plymouth Argyle, which opened last year. And they had named the boardroom the Jack Leslie Boardroom. And that wasn't under, as a result of pushing by us or any other campaigner. That was their own independent thing. So at the top of the club, there's things going in the right direction. And I hope that will be the general trend. And certainly nothing will be a more visible representation of that than a statue. The first statue of a footballer outside Plymouth Argyle will be, black footballer Jack Leslie. I think that's a really powerful, statement. Wow, he's up there on the plinth, Argyle legend, and look at his story. So that's going to change, as Matt said, change things very differently. I'm going to take this opportunity to remind myself that I promised my family I would bail out at 8 o'clock today, and I've overrun. Okay. So I'm going to say thank you very much and goodbye, and leave Matt and Jason to field difficult questions that I know are coming.
It's time for me to call it an end too. We normally end at 8 o'clock. This has gone on longer than any session I've done up to now, but it's been absolutely wonderful. I mean, I'm a great football fan myself. I really enjoyed the Jack Leslie story. I live in Cornwall, Launceston in Cornwall. I go to Plymouth Argyle irregularly now, but I've had that experience as well of moving down from London to a very rural area, which is entirely different. And the Cornish themselves are not particularly, or weren't at the time, particularly keen on newcomers. I've got a quick advert. Tuesday, the 6th of July, Tom DeWitt is going to run the next session of the Tolpuddle Radical History School. He's going to take people around the Tolpuddle Martyrs Museum. And He's going to do that. And on the 17th of July, we got protests in Dorset and Barbados calling for reparations of slavery from the wealthy Drax family, and a panel discussion on tackling racism. On Sunday, the 18th of July, the Radical Session History School session will be on Facebook and YouTube about the late Joan Maynard. That's in the chat. So if I've rushed through that, you can see that. Thank you very much to all the panelists, Matt, Greg, and Jason. It's been great to meet you. I hope you're going to send me a ticket to the unveiling of this statue. I'd love to be there to see that. We're still trying to get a plaque unveiled on the Hoe to the Toll Puddle Martyrs. I want to go to that as well. I mean it about the statue. I'm very keen to be there. I'd love to be there.
You one.
Yeah, thanks very much.
We'll get you a pint in the Dolphin, where the Toll Puddle Martyrs were treated.
I know the Dolphin. I know the Dolphin. Thank you very much for bringing us up to date with your experience. Is absolutely brilliant. I just found that wonderful, and I think we've given everyone a lot to go away and think about. So thank you all very much. Take care. Enjoy the rest of your evening. Goodbye.
Thank you, everybody.
Nice, Jason. It was amazing.